Subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I will make my opening statement at this time. The Syrian war has raged for nearly 6 years. Syria is in chaos. Terrorists, foreign fighters, rebels, foreign governments, all are engaged in battle for territory and control of different aspects of Syria. On the screen, let's go back to the previous screen. You'll see different areas of Syria and the different areas that are controlled by ISIS is in the dark section. Let's flip to the next screen quickly. I don't know if you can read that or not. There should be, at least the panel in front of you, you should have the different actors, the state actors on one side and then the non-state actors on the other. The state actors are divided into pro-Assad and actors that are opposed to Assad, with the Middle Eastern countries at the top of each list, and then you have non-Middle Eastern countries at the bottom of each list. And you can see that there are numerous countries aligned on both sides. And then there are non-state actors that are involved, and those are a multitude of groups. They call themselves different things at different times. Some are terrorist groups, some claim not to be terrorist groups, but that are terrorist groups. One of the biggest things that I think we should know is that we got terrorist groups on both sides. We got Hezbollah on one side, which is obviously a terrorist group fighting for Assad, and we have ISIS on the other side that is a terrorist group. Al-Qaeda is a terrorist group, and they're also somewhat aligned with the anti-Assad group. You have a multitude of actors all seeking their own self-interest in Syria, and this hearing is about really what do we see happening not only now, but hopefully what is the end game after 6 years of war. The losers in this have been the Syrian people. And I think they will continue to be the losers because as the war rages, the war affects them more than anyone else. 500,000 Syrian people have died at least in this war. And I don't call it a conflict. I call it a war. When you start dropping bombs on people, that is not a conflict. That is a war. 50,000 of those people, by all estimates, have been children. 5 million Syrians have become refugees. 6 million are internally displaced. So that has been about 11% of the Syrian population killed or injured since the start of the violence. The perpetrator of all of this sits directly at the regime of Bashar Assad and his backers in Moscow and Tehran. Assad has pursued a policy of murdering anybody that expressed criticism of his power. He uses barrel bombs, and it doesn't make any difference who those barrel bombs fall on as long as he thinks they are opposed to his regime. Russia intervened in Syria in September of 2015 and began airstrikes against what it called terrorist targets. The Russians apparently are not very good in their targeting because it seems as though they have killed thousands of people in Syria and they haven't all been terrorists. Syrian Network for Human Rights suggested last year that Russian strikes killed more Syrians than ISIS members. Iran's terrorist proxy Hezbollah has also bloodied its hands in Syria. Since 2013, Hezbollah has operated openly in Syria, killing on behalf of the Assad regime. It has also created in Syria a perfect environment for out-of-towners, as I call them, who show up with their own self-interest, including terrorist groups. ISIS is there, and while ISIS no longer controls as much territory as they did in 2014, they still control major aspects of the Syrian population centers. I have furnished each of our panelists a map, and there's also a map on the wall due to time constraints. I can't go into all of the details, but the thin black line in the middle of Syria and in southern part of Syria is what is controlled by ISIS. The Kurds control the northern purple area. The yellow area is controlled by al-Qaeda and so-called Syrian dissidents and rebel groups. And then Assad controls the pink area to the west. The questions to be asked today is, what is going to happen in the end game? What is the end game? And also, I would like to know from our panelists, what is the national security interest of the United States? Should we ratchet it up? Should we do what we're doing now, which is kind of the Vietnam syndrome, or should we leave it to the Middle East to resolve this conflict themselves? I would like the opinion of all three panelists to those three questions. And I will turn over to the gentleman from Massachusetts who has fled to Washington to get out of the snow for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Poe, and thank you for holding this hearing today. The situation we've watched unfold in Syria over the last 6 years has been wrought with complexities, and the Chairman and I agree, with chaos and atrocities under the Assad government. Today, the war and the resulting humanitarian crisis is nothing short of a global tragedy. So I'm grateful for the attendance of our witnesses, Mr. Hassan, Ambassador Hoff, Ms. Dalton, for their valuable insight into the ongoing political strife and challenges that the international community, as well as the new administration, faces in the months and years ahead. If we're going to be smart about terrorism, and specifically the rise and role of ISIL, then we must first come to terms with the reality that their model of terrorism is built on a foundation of radicalization. To continue fighting ISIL on the battlefield requires that we recognize this pattern of recruitment and evolution in fighting tactics. As we make progress in diminishing their territory, we must be mindful of their shifts in strategy to prioritize covert radicalization rather than maintain geographic strongholds. It becomes essential that we engage in this war of ideas by providing potential recruits with a choice of narratives. Those choices should include a path forward other than terrorism. But even more importantly, we must recognize that strengthening the resiliency and stability of communities is necessary for eradicating terrorism. And when families live in fear, and when no one is accountable for keeping them safe and protecting their freedom, we'll never be able to eliminate the conditions that produce these terrorists. Countering ISIL in Syria, however, cannot be viewed as a one-dimensional prospect. Preventing attacks and limiting ISIL's capacity to operate within its network caliphates are also crucial to eliminating the terrorist threat there. The U.S. cannot do this alone, nor should we. We should also be wary of the compromises we're being asked to make, allegedly in the name of securing peace and combating terrorism. I have grave concerns about the role of Russia and Iran and what they intend to play in countering ISIL and preventing future terrorists. Left without proper oversight or debate, the same Congress may 5, 10, or 15 years from now preside over a hearing of the same subject, examining how a Russian and Iranian-led resolution to this crisis allowed ISIL to survive and become embedded in the region like other terrorist groups which continue to pose a threat to the U.S. today. For the time being, I believe we still have strong allies in Europe and Middle East whose interests align with ours and who can make valuable contributions along with our own to tackle this threat. Our existing partnerships on intelligence sharing, security, military strategy are robust, and we're united with our allies along Common goal for a peaceful resolution to this gruesome conflict and stable political outcome for the people of Syria. Even with close partnerships, there's still room for even stronger, more effective cooperation to close some of the gaps and inconsistencies that ISIL continues to exploit. With all the progress in the past decades to cement effective security partnerships among the U.S. and our allies, there's now a sound foundation to build upon that together we can isolate and destroy these terrorist threats. Neglecting these partnerships and incredible assets in the fight against terrorism would be a costly mistake. Countering terrorism in Syria is a complex, multifaceted issue. If we fail to craft a comprehensive plan to address it, aspects of our national security will be compromised. I look forward to the witnesses' testimony today and hearing from you on how to balance these diverse and sometimes seemingly divergent considerations when attempting to combat ISIL in Syria. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. The chair will recognize members for 1 minute opening statements, and the chair will follow the 60-second rule, not 60 minutes. Gentleman from South Carolina, recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Judge Poe, and he and I work together very closely on the 60-second rule, I can assure you. But I want to thank the chairman for having such distinguished witnesses, and already this has been a helpful hearing to me. The map showing the level of control, how narrow it is, Damascus west and north, but also to see the success of the Kurdish regional efforts from Iraq. It's very important to me that we support the people of the Kurdish region with the understanding that they are working to maintain and build a stable Iraq. And by doing that, by not indicating expanding beyond the borders. But they are very successful, and it's been, that was very instructive to me, so I'm very, very hopeful. Additionally, I look forward to hearing of your efforts regarding counter-propaganda. Thank you, and I, within the 60 seconds, hereby yield the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Snyder.
Thank you, Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, for convening this important hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for providing your expertise to inform this incredibly important discussion. I hope that we all came here today with the recognition that Syria must be a priority for the new administration. With 5 million refugees and 6 million internally displaced people, and more than 500,000, mostly civilians, killed, the six-year civil war is the greatest humanitarian crisis of the new century. Syrian borders key American allies, namely Israel, Jordan, and Turkey. The civil war is putting extreme pressure on the bordering states, as well as the European nations. For 6 years, the situation has only gotten worse. I hope our witnesses can shed light on how to neutralize and defeat the terrorist groups ISIS and Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, while at the same time working towards a political solution for the country that does not include Bashar al-Assad or cede control of Syria to Iran and its proxy Hezbollah, nor lead to further instability and the consequent return of terrorist groups. As you've all shared in your testimony, there are no easy solutions or even mostly good choices, but walking away is clearly not an option.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Cook.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think this is a great hearing. The problem that I have always with this is that every 6 months, a year, the players, the situation changes. And for us to get a grasp on this, it's almost impossible. We just had a similar hearing on the House Armed Services Committee, a different approach. And I did want to thank Ambassador Hoff for his service in Vietnam, where you were awarded the Purple Heart. And I understand that you were involved in the 1983 investigation of the bombing of the Marine Barracks, 1st Battalion, 8th Marines. That was my, I was not with them. That was my former battalion that I was there. And what happened then still lingers, and I hope we can go back to some of the causes as they relate to today. I yield back. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Rohrabacher from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. When we talk about 500,000 people who are dead and been killed in this, let's just admit this isn't just Assad. Isn't just Assad. We keep saying Assad killed all these people. The fact is, if you look at our allies, whether it be Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, even the UAE, and certainly Iran, who's not an ally, but in that region, any of those countries, any of those governments that faced an insurgency that we kept on being financed over and over again would kill that many people. Assad is no different than the other dictators, yet we have insisted that he has to go, and thus the conflict goes on and more people are made refugees and killed. Who's at fault? I think we should stick our nose out of this and let them have, yes, they're Assad and they're dictators in all the rest of these countries, and the United States shouldn't keep these conflicts going on and on and on. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Anybody else wish to make an opening statement? The chair recognizes Ms. Titus.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. You know, throughout the campaign, we heard from candidate Trump that he knew more than the generals, and he had a secret plan for fighting ISIS. Now, apparently, he's gone to the Pentagon to ask for some assistance. As we go through this hearing, I'd be curious to know what y'all think about his willingness or ability to stick with a plan if we come up with it, or if our policy is just going to jump from tweet to tweet. Thank you.
Chair will now introduce all three witnesses and then
Mr. Chairman.
ask.
If I might, I originally not intended to make introductory remarks.
Chair recognizes for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. The comments by the gentleman from California sort of stir where I am on this. I think that this nation would be well advised never to arm any entity without having an easily articulable plan for an end state that's preferable to the current status quo. And while Assad certainly has blood on his hands, I can't find, nor could former Secretary of State John Kerry, the Free Syrian Army. I couldn't tell you who leads it, which leaves us with two alternative solutions to the Assad problem, that being Jabhat al-Nusra or Jabhat al-Fatah al-Sham or ISIS, neither of which I think are a preferable option to a dictator in Assad who has provided some level of stability, created a circumstance wherein 51% of college graduates in Syria are women, and a safe zone for individuals of ethnic and religious minorities. I'd yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, gentlemen. The chair will now introduce the witnesses. Mr. Hassan is a senior fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. He is co-author of ISIS Inside the Army of Terror, a New York Times bestseller. Ambassador Frederick Hoff is the director of the Rafik Harar Center for Middle East at the Atlantic Council. Previously, Ambassador Hoff served as special coordinator for the State Department's Office of Special Envoy for Middle East Peace. Ms. Melissa Dalton is a senior fellow and the deputy director of the International Security Program at CSIS. Her research focuses on U.S. defense policy in the Middle East, global U.S. defense strategy, and security cooperation with U.S. allies. Mr. Hassan, we'll start with you. Each of you have 5 minutes. When you see the red light, stop talking. Mr. Hassan.
Thank you very much, Chairman Poe and members of the subcommittee. It's a privilege to present today here my views on Syria and terrorism. I want to basically give like an optimistic view first. Despite the grim situation inside Syria, I think the U.S. government has an opportunity to stem the challenges presented by the two international terrorist organizations operating in Syria, the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. In fact, I would argue that the United States has more options, or options didn't necessarily have 2 years ago, including a way to prevent not only the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda from operating in Syria or weakening both of them, but also other radical groups from operating in at least 50 to 60% of Syria. The territory I'm talking about include areas that the Islamic State controls or once controlled since 2014. you know, the way ISIS does things, and when they take an area, they act as a washing powder, I would say, which is basically to eradicate any Islamist and jihadist cells operating in the areas where they operate, because they want to prevent any support system for their rivals. So they've done that in 50 to 60% of Syria, or 50% of Syria, to be more precise. For Al-Qaeda now to go back and fill the vacuum left by ISIS, it has to revive dormant cells or rebuild influence almost from scratch. So there's an opportunity there to shape the communities in which ISIS operates today. So the expulsion of the Islamic State offers a rare opportunity, I would say, to implement a strategy to build an alternative to jihadist organization, more so than you were able in 2014, when dozens of different armed groups operating in these areas. So the liberation of these areas by the US-led coalition creates a de facto American sphere of influence, which both Russia and the regime have accepted, for now at least. This counterterrorism strategy involves a more foresighted or far-sighted policy of establishing de facto safe zones in part of Syria where inhabitants can be protected from jihadists and from the regime, and where the international community can also ensure that Al-Qaeda, which now operates in only 1 to 2% of Syria, at least in a dominant manner, from rolling back into areas from which the Islamic State is expelled or is being expelled. Those safe zones can be established in the areas where the US and allies, as for ISIS, as I said. The strategy I'm proposing is basically a baseline, meaning it requires minimal American commitment. It builds on what the Americans are already doing inside Syria against the Islamic State, without which any fight against jihadism is doomed to fail. So this is the baseline. The war against the Islamic State has reached a point, in my opinion, where the Americans cannot, or the US forces or the US-led coalition cannot just pull back or pull out from Syria because obviously the ongoing fight against ISIS. It can choose, though, the US can choose to continue with the current strategy, which I consider disastrous, and allow various forces to fill the ensuing vacuum after ISIS is defeated in some areas. Instead, I would propose that the US must use its pre-existing leverage to build a sound policy, sound strategy that breaks away from the current strategy, which overlooks the political environment that enabled the rise of ISIS and other jihadists in the first place. What's lacking in the current policy is a real kind of strategy that utilizes this leverage to ensure the removal of jihadists, to prevent their return, to protect local communities from indiscriminate bombardments by the Assad regime, and minimize the conflict that is emerging among various allies in northern Syria, namely the Kurds on one hand and the rebels in Turkey, and the rebels and Turkey on the other hand. This strategy is obviously not an invitation for an American occupation of Syria or long-term nation buildings that President Donald Trump has explicitly criticized. Instead, it's both realistic, essential, and expands on battlefield victories already scored over the past 2.5 years of Operation Inherent Resolve against the Islamic State in northern Syria. The strategy can, in my opinion, I think should acknowledge the fractured nature of the Syrian conflict today. To get a sense of this fracture, you have to look at the kind of the map that Chairman Poe just presented, which basically divides Syria into 4 quadrants. One is the Caliphate terrain, which extends from eastern Aleppo all the way to Iraq, Iraqi border, all the way to Palmyra in central Syria. And then you have the second one, the second quadrant, which is rebel-held areas in north and the south. This is where the Americans and their allies, the Israelis, the Jordanians, and others, have actually done very well in ensuring that jihadists don't have dominance in that area, and that there is a moderate, like a relatively reliable, moderate rebel coalition there, and where Al-Qaeda and Islamic State have some presence, but they don't dominate. And the problem there, though, is that the rebel presence there is fragile and requires a policy to ensure that they withstand the pressure from jihadis. And actually, today is a good example of that because Jabhat al-Nusra or Al-Qaeda has started to challenge that dynamic in southern Syria. The third quadrant, very quickly, is the more fragmented northwest.
The gentleman's time has expired, and the subcommittee being recessed for votes will start 5 minutes after the last vote has ended. Subcommittee's in recess. The subcommittee will come to order. Ambassador Hoff will hear your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Keating, members of the committee, I would summarize the key points of my testimony for the record as follows. First, both the Obama and the Trump administrations have defined defeating terror in Syria largely in terms of neutralizing two rival descendants of al-Qaeda in Iraq, namely the so-called Islamic State, ISIL, and the Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, JFS, formerly known as the Nusra Front. ISIL has had mainly a live and let live arrangement with the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad. JFS has fought the regime while at the same time trying to dominate nationalist Syria First armed rebel units. Second, terminating the military capabilities of both of these organizations is critically important. But if our goal in Syria is to kill terror and keep it dead, ultimately, a political system reflecting legitimacy has to take hold. Absent a political system that virtually all Syrians see as satisfactory, with no superior alternative, absent that, extremists will seek to rise again to fill the vacuum created by gross corruption, incompetence, and brutality. Third, the main obstacle to political legitimacy in Syria is the survival of a regime headed by Bashar al-Assad and supported by Iran and Russia. The collective punishment and mass homicide survival strategy of this regime has been the main factor behind a humanitarian abomination and a political catastrophe. Yesterday, the Atlantic Council released a report entitled Breaking Aleppo. This report details and documents the campaign of terror inflicted by the Assad regime and Russia on the civilians of Aleppo. It adds to the enormous body of evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Syria over the past 6 years, the overwhelming majority of which have been committed by the regime and its allies. These crimes have helped ISIL and JFS enormously in their recruiting. Fourth, even if the diplomatic pursuit of political legitimacy in Syria is a long-term project, neutralizing ISIL and JFS militarily are urgent priorities. Two successive presidents have defined both organizations as threats to American national security. ISIL in Syria, which has planned and executed major atrocities in Europe, is currently under attack by a U.S.-led air coalition and a U.S.-advised ground force, largely Kurdish in composition. I understand the administration is reviewing this military approach in light of Turkish objections to the Kurdish role and the objective desirability of liberating densely populated areas with highly skilled military professionals. JFS is under attack by U.S. and Russian air assets independently, with Syrian nationalist rebel forces seeking ways and means to defeat it. These nationalists will need a tight Russian leash on Assad and on Iranian-led foreign militias in order to move effectively against JFS. It is not yet clear that they'll get Russian cooperation. Fifth and finally, thanks to Russian and Iranian military intervention, Assad seems secure in at least part of Syria. Iran in particular needs Assad to bind Syria to Lebanon's Hezbollah, another important Islamist terrorist group. But Assad's political well-being means the indefinite continuation of state terror in Syria, as the United States and its partners move ideally with dispatch against ISIL and JFS. Any temptation to make common cause with or improve the political prospects of Syria's premier practitioner of terror, Bashar al-Assad, must be resisted. Reports of Russian disaffection with Assad and with Iranian-led militias should be explored. Killing terror in Syria and keeping it dead will, I'm afraid, be a long-term endeavor for the United States and its partners, one extending far beyond the defeats of ISIL and JFS.
Thank you, Ambassador Hoff. Miss Dalton.
Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, it is an honor to testify before you today with my excellent colleagues Ambassador Hoff and Hassan. Syria stands today at the epicenter of a regional conflict with global consequences for U.S. interests. Countering terrorism is one aspect of a deeper problem set. The Trump administration and the Congress have the opportunity to change the course of U.S. policy towards Syria by nesting short-term operations into a strategy. Americans have no interest in perennial military interventions in the Middle East. We have demands for resources at home and competing geostrategic objectives in Europe and Asia. However, the United States has compelling reasons to counter terrorism and to address the broader factors that have enabled the rise of the so-called Islamic State and al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria, Jabhat Fatah al-Sham. The growth of Iranian proxy groups and a battle-hardened Lebanese Hezbollah in Syria also pose counterterrorism challenges. Additionally, the United States has to contend with intertwined realities that could challenge its ability to influence outcomes to its advantage. Among these reasons are countering terrorists and the roots of terrorism, which threaten the U.S. homeland and our allies and partners, preventing military confrontation with Russia and Iran while limiting the long-term subversive influence they could have in the region, and stemming conflict emanating from Syria from further destabilizing neighboring states in Europe. Achieving U.S. objectives in Syria will require inherent trade-offs in the policy choices the Trump administration could pursue. Complicating matters, 6 years of war have torn Syria apart. It no longer exists as a unitary whole, requiring different approaches in the north, south, east, and west. Woven throughout the options in Syria are geopolitical choices with which the United States will have to grapple, including how to manage tensions with Russia in a way that secures U.S. interests and contests Russian aggression globally while cooperating where it is advantageous and feasible. How to calibrate pressure on Iran's destabilizing activities without provoking blowback to U.S. forces operating in the area and while attaining an enduring political outcome in Syria, and how to manage deeply fraught relations with NATO ally Turkey while leveraging the highly capable YPG to fight ISIS in northern Syria. The Trump administration and Congress should work together to forge a coordinated U.S. strategy for Syria with allies and partners. The goals of this strategy should be to degrade ISIS and JFS, achieve a nationwide cessation of hostilities and a negotiated transition of power in Damascus, and consolidate counterterrorism gains by knitting together local security and governance in the 4 segments of Syria. Such an approach will require leveraging multiple tools of U.S. statecraft, including registering strong concerns with Russia and Iran about their support for Assad's brutal tactics and their long-term ambitions in Syria, and being prepared to back up those concerns with sanctions and coercion. Rebuilding communication and trust with Turkey. While pressing on human rights concerns, we should emphasize the criticality of working through differences as NATO allies. Bolstering support to Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi and his efforts to restore security and stability in Iraq. If Iraq falters, ISIS and other terrorist groups will regrow in western Iraq and push back into Syria. Working with the UN to leverage and integrate the Astana process into UN-mediated negotiations. Calibrating sanctions pressure on Putin to convince Assad to accede to the negotiating table, requiring Russian action before alleviating sanctions. Ukraine should not be a quid pro quo for Syria. Synchronizing operations for Raqqa and Mosul to squeeze ISIS and aligning covert and non-covert approaches versus ISIS and JFS. Letting operational conditions on the ground inform strategic adjustments and withdrawal timelines. Countering ISIS and JFS will be a multi-year effort. Increasing both special operations forces and conventional ground forces in Syria and Iraq based on commanders' assessed requirements, conducting training and combat operations with local partners. Consolidating gains from operations, knitting connections among local security forces and governance structures so that terrorist groups cannot grow back. being strategic about deploying the local partner forces that will be the most credible, accounting for ethno-sectarian differences, even if it requires a slower pace for operations. If the United States commits resources to establishing a safe zone, I recommend constructing one in southern Syria where operational dynamics are clearer than in the north, and to ensure that it ties to political negotiations to end the civil war so as to avoid an open-ended commitment. We should also enhance intelligence sharing and improve coordination among military, intelligence, and law enforcement entities, and continue to provide humanitarian assistance to besieged civilian areas, with clear and immediate repercussions in the case of outside interference. Finally, we should seek a new authorization for the use of force for the U.S. intervention in Syria and Iraq, providing for operational flexibility to U.S. commanders. The presence of ISIS and al-Qaeda in Syria demands our immediate attention. However, the United States must anchor its counterterrorism approach in a broader strategy if it is to prevail. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank all y'all for your testimony. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. First of all, I gave each of you a list of the participants as I know them as of today. Ambassador Hoff, I'll just ask you quickly, is this a fair statement of the lineup of the players?
I think broadly speaking, Mr. Chairman, it's a fair lineup. The only thing off the top of my head I might take issue with here is listing ISIS under the roster of anti-Assad forces. There has been, for the past 3 years, a live and let live relationship between the regime and ISIS. The regime's military effort, the military effort of Russia, has been directed at elements other than ISIS, with rare exception.
Okay, thank you. And it's a fair statement that there's an ebb and flow of the anti-Assad forces as to who they are today, whether they're anti-Assad or whether they're just working for their own self-interest in particular areas of the country. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, it is, Mr. Chairman. There's probably an example of just about everything in Syria.
You have the bona fide rebel forces who want to overthrow Assad. You have out-of-towners who are criminals that are looking to loot, pillage the area. You have people coming in to take over territory. You just have everybody there in the anti-Assad group. Is that a fair statement?
You've got local elements that for criminal purposes have taken full advantage of local situations. You also have an ebb and flow of people depending on resource availability. One of the great successes of the al-Qaeda elements in Syria is that they've been pretty well resourced and have been able to pull away young Syrian men who are anti-Assad, originally lined up with the Free Syrian Army and so forth, but who have gone to work for an organization where they know where breakfast is going to come from. They know they've got a serviceable weapon. They know they've got plenty of ammunition. So that's been a factor as well.
Are any of the Middle Eastern countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, are they funding any of these groups like al-Qaeda, quasi-terrorist groups?
I think, Mr. Chairman, the bulk of the evidence suggests that at an official level, no. These governments are not funding al-Qaeda or ISIS or any of those.
But it would be a fair statement that money is coming from those countries.
You bet. It would be a totally fair statement. There is money coming, I think in recent reports, Qatar and Kuwait have earned honorable or dishonorable mentions in this regard.
Dishonorable mentions. So you have at least 3 terrorist groups. You have ISIS, you have al-Qaeda, and you have Hezbollah, 3 terrorist groups. Questionable whose side they're on any given day. Let me ask you this. The U.S., let's talk about the United States role. In the past, we decided we'd fund 5,000 so-called moderate rebels. That turned out to be a disaster. It cost us $500 million. We armed 60 of them, and they surrendered after the first day. I say that to say it's difficult to know who we're dealing with as a country when we turn over American equipment and American money. What should the United States do? Should we just stay the course, give a little money, a little weapon here and there? Should we go all in with the, with the B-52s? So I say that not facetiously, but all in, or should we just say, this is not our battle? Which of those three options, and I'm going to ask each of you to give me which option the United States should take from this point on. Mr. Hassan, which position should the U.S. take?
I think what the U.S. should be doing and what should...
Which of those three options?
I think they have to be more, they have to go all politically all in. And I think that's where the U.S. has been lagging behind. They haven't pegged the political track to the military track in eastern Syria.
Ambassador Hoff.
I would say all in, using a whole of government approach to this. It's not entirely a military issue against ISIL. It is, for sure. But there are, the security of Americans is what's at stake in what's
political solution
bubbling up out of Syria.
And Miss Dalton.
I think we have to go in with a multifaceted approach that pushes hard politically, that creates leverage with Russia and Iran to pressure Assad to come to the negotiating table and to change the military balance on the ground by continuing to support the groups that we've been working with.
Thank all three of you. And I recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Ranking Member, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Dalton, you mentioned in your opening remarks Ukraine should not be a quid pro quo for Syria. What prompted those statements from you?
Thank you, Ranking Member Keating. There have been reports of late that as the new administration is examining the policy options before it, which are, of course, global in scale given where the United States sits in the world, that they might take a different approach to Russia, and that perhaps there is some transactional trade space to be had in areas where Russia and the United States are conflicting or have been conflicting. And there is a notion that perhaps an agreement could be reached with the Russians such that the United States would turn a blind eye to Russia's activities in Ukraine, in Crimea, in exchange for Russian cooperation against ISIS in Syria and working with Assad. The reality is that would be strategically foolhardy for the United States, in my opinion, to go down that pathway. Russia responds to strength, and rewarding Russia for bad behavior by encouraging more bad behavior doesn't seem to be a recipe for success.
Yeah, let me follow that up if I could. The Trump administration has repeatedly embraced the idea that the U.S. should cooperate with Russia on counter-ISIS or ISIL operations in Syria. How possible is that engagement in security and cooperating with Russia without working with Iran and its affiliates? Any of you?
Yes, I think before turning to the Iran bit of that question, I think it's important to note that the vast majority, up to 80% of Russia's airstrikes in Syria, have not been on ISIS targets. They have been on other Syrian opposition groups, some of which have been supported by the United States and our partners, and against civilian targets in Syria. So the idea, in a very sort of objective way of looking at this, our objectives are not aligned with Russia in terms of...
Ambassador Hoff?
Yep.
Same question.
Yes, sir. I would certainly not begrudge the administration the ability to conduct its due diligence about the possibility of some kind of diplomatic and even eventually military cooperation with Russia. I have my doubts as to whether there's any there. But doing the diplomatic due diligence, look, there is no doubt whatsoever that the leadership in Russia has no affection, much less respect, for Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad has served a political purpose to date for President Putin. for our government to explore whether there's a possibility of Russia using some leverage to push Assad into meaningful negotiations, I think it's worth a try.
Yeah. Mr. Hassan, how could you, Mr. Hassan, I mean, could you follow up, but also talk about the ability of the U.S. and Russia sharing information, vital information in that quest?
Absolutely. I think it's possible to cleave away Russia from Iran, but only under one condition, which is that the U.S. Pursues the right policy inside Syria, regardless of how Russia perceives that, which is basically a change in Syria that is seen as a legitimate change inside Syria, and defeat and focus on the political environment inside Syria as much as the military challenge that ISIS and Al-Qaeda pose. Only then will Russia start to maybe work with Americans in the right way against the interests of Iran. We know that the priorities of the two countries are different. They're long-term priorities, at least.
Good. Perhaps, if I could interrupt, just to put this on the table, we're running out of time, but I think other people will follow up. We haven't heard you talk about safe zones. If you could comment on some of the drawbacks of safe and dangers of safe zones, what we should be looking out for, what's possible.
I think the main thing to try to understand about safe zones is that it requires very strong protection, not only from 30,000 feet, not just a no-fly zone. It requires decisive military power on the ground. This is what distinguishes a safe zone from a killing zone, where people are inadvertently drawn in to a situation where they're not protected on the ground, and as a result, slaughter takes place.
Yeah, and infiltration from terrorists. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Cook.
Thank you very much. One of the countries that's not listed right on this list or either list is Israel. And a lot of the foreign policy that we have in the United States is very sensitive to Israel's position. Do you have any comments in regards to how Israel views this situation? I know their relations with Russia isn't bad, but their position against Hezbollah and Iran, I think, is well known, and they consider them a major threat to the country. Anyone?
Thank you, Congressman. I believe that from a security perspective, Israel is very concerned about the growth and development of IRGC-backed groups, not just Lebanese Hezbollah, but the up to 115,000 Iranian-backed groups that are present in Syria and bolstering the Assad regime, and what that portends for the long-term presence of those groups in Syria, and how that could potentially serve as a beachhead for IRGC activities that could threaten Israel and its interests. On top of that, the fact that Lebanese Hezbollah has acquired further operational refinement and capability development through its activities in Syria that could then be taken back to Lebanon and threaten Israel, I think is also something that the Israelis are very concerned about from a security perspective.
I noticed Hamas was not listed on there. Do you have any comments about Hamas? Anybody? No? They're a non-player?
I think, Congressman, Hamas has been essentially a non-player in Syria. There used to be an office in Damascus. It left, and I believe it's been a non-player for a while in the Syrian context.
Okay. Going back to Assad, I still, being a history major in the history of Hezbollah and Iran and their conduct there, it's very hard for me to accept the Russian position in Syria and some of the other countries there. The pro-Assad forces, I think they're very accurate there. Pro-Assad, obviously Iran, North Korea, China, and Hezbollah. And so I'm still very, very nervous about any Russian affiliation with Assad, and because of his conduct, both the present ruler and his father, which has been going on for years, and the number of people that have been killed in that country. I yield back. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to ask you about the perception of the United States in the region and within Syria. You know, with the travel ban, with our unwillingness to do our part to help refugees, the recent announcement perhaps that they're going to continue to go down this path. What kind of perception will we have to overcome to be successful in the area? And is this working in the hands of some of the terrorist groups to use as propaganda against us and making the situation worse? Anybody or all of you?
Sure. I think many people, especially people who are in charge of the campaign against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, recognize that the framing of the fight against these organizations is as important as the military challenge. So if you have like 60 countries fighting ISIS, and ISIS is telling everyone that these are crusaders, these are not fighting us because we are terrorists, but fighting the Sunnis. Look at the devastation in Mosul, but also look at the devastation in Aleppo. These are two superpowers doing work in two countries against Sunnis. So I think the framing of the fight against ISIS is as crucial as the military challenge. The ban itself is not as much discussed in the region as here, obviously, but I think there's a perception matters a lot in Syria and Iraq, and that's why there's a danger in working with the Russians without really working out a political formula in the two countries.
Ms. Halton or Ambassador?
I would say, Congresswoman, the United States does have definitely an image and a perception problem in Syria. It was not born with the executive order. Okay, it goes back a few years. Expectations that the Obama administration, for example, would do something short of invading and occupying the country to protect Syrian civilians from mass murder. The fact that that never happened, unintended consequence for sure, but it does bear on our reputation in the country. My organization, the Atlantic Council, recently published what I consider to be a very, very important nonpartisan, bipartisan effort. Steve Hadley and former Secretary Madeleine Albright have published a Middle East Strategy Task Force report. And what comes through clearly in this report is the absolute need we and our transatlantic partners have for partnerships within the region. Ultimately, if terror is going to be killed and kept dead in the Middle East, it's going to be Muslims in the lead, all right? And again, nobody begrudges the President of the United States his authorities, his views about the national security of the United States. But when we do these things, I think we have to keep in mind the imperative of partnership in the region, who our partners need to be. And I suspect the administration will be doing a better job in that respect.
Thank you. Ms. Dalton?
I would completely align myself with Ambassador Hoff's remarks in terms of the necessity of reaching out not only to our traditional partners, but also civil society organizations on the ground. The best messenger of countering violent extremism is local actors, local religious leaders, community activists that are credible in the eyes of the people that we're trying to reach. And I think bolstering resourcing for those efforts through third-party means is exceptionally important, and really creating a coalition of not just government to government, but also public-private partnerships also must be part of the equation.
Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Hoff, thanks for your service. In 2015, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, reported through their intelligence sources that ISIS had been able to co-opt or to obtain passport information, data, biometric data, facilities, equipment, et cetera, in Syria, and they were able to falsify or manufacture passports in that regard with that information. I'm just wondering, since that time, this is the end of 2015 as I understand it and as I recall it, did we ever verify that, and does ISIS, or Al-Qaeda for that matter, currently maintain access to Syrian government facilities, equipment, biometric data, passport information, et cetera, that would allow either one of those groups to forge passports and or falsify identities? Anybody?
Just quickly, I think the only place that you know, people inside Syria talked about with little evidence was Aleppo, but ISIS did not go to Aleppo. So if there was another, if there was one group that took the, you know, seized these ones, it wouldn't be ISIS. It would be a Free Syrian Army groups.
But involved in the Free Syrian Army, I mean, we have a hard time, I think, distinguishing who's who, and it changes in some respects, seems to be month to month, or if you want to say year to year. Could that information have fallen into the hands of Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda operatives, even if they weren't particularly ISIS operatives?
I can't say, to be honest.
What, based on that, I mean, and maybe in conjunction with that, I mean, what confidence should the United States government have in the government of Syria and the actors in Syria to accurately confirm the identities of immigrants or refugees from Syria?
Congressman, my sense, and I'm certainly not an expert in consular affairs, my sense is that there is a very intensive and very long vetting process for Syrian refugees to come to the United States. My suspicion is that the administration will probably find some tweaks, if you will, to improve that on the margins. But again, not being a consular specialist, my sense from people who are in this business is that Syrian refugees considered to come to the United States get a pretty thorough scrubbing.
I'm not doubting at all the capabilities, the diligence, et cetera, of the people in the United States doing the vetting. What I'm questioning or trying to determine is the validity of the information that they compare against, who's giving it to them, what their interests may be, those who are giving the information, and the validity and the confidence in the validity of that information coming from. Does all that information come from the Assad government, or is there anybody else providing information? Or if you don't know, you don't know. But I'm just, looking at the map. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of different players, right? So when a refugee comes from here, are they getting the information from Damascus, they being the United States, to vet this person? Or is somebody in this region or any of these other regions providing some form of governance or tyranny or whatever you want to call it? Or where's that information coming from? Do we know? Do you know?
Congressman, speaking for myself, I don't know. Syrian refugees in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, elsewhere in Europe, who apply to come to the United States have, in most cases, documentation from the Syrian government, passport, ID, and so forth. That, I think, is where the investigation starts. There are numerous agencies of the United States government involved in this, numerous international organizations as well. And although I don't know, I strongly suspect that the kinds of questions you're putting your finger on as to the validity of basic identity documents probably rates high in these investigations.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
I thank the gentleman. Ms. Dalton, understand that you need to leave. There may be questions that members of the committee have not been able to ask you, and they may turn those in writing, which will be forwarded to you, and would expect you to answer those questions within a week of when you receive them. And with that understanding, then you can leave.
Thank you so much, Chairman. I beg the subcommittee's forgiveness. I have a flight to catch today, but thank you so much for the opportunity to testify, and I'd be glad to answer any follow-up questions.
Thank you, Ms. Dalton. Ms. Torres, you probably had all your questions from Ms. Dalton, but you're recognized.
Absolutely, but that's okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Terrorism, in many ways, is fueled by poverty and poor governance. In the long run, if Syria doesn't see better governance and prosperity, then even if ISIS is defeated, something else will take its place. Getting back, Ambassador Hoff, to what you were trying to get at earlier when you said, who should our partners in the region be? Who should we be working with there? I wonder if you can sort of look at your crystal ball 5 years from now, down the road. What are the prospects for the Syrian economy and government? Will the Syrian economy and government be better off if Russia and Iran are in the main outside powers shaping events in Syria? Or what would that look like if the U.S. and Europe are the main outside powers shaping events in Syria?
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman. I would say off the top of my head that if Iran, in particular, is playing a decisive role 5 years from now in Syria, Syria will be basically a smoking pit, and it will be hemorrhaging human beings in all directions. Iran needs Bashar al-Assad for one thing and one thing only. He and his entourage are the only people in a very nationalistic country willing to subordinate Syria 100% to Iran on the issue of Hezbollah. Iran knows there is nobody else in the country willing to go that far. So from Iran's point of view, it's Bashar or nothing. Now, there are estimates out there that the rebuilding of Syria is going to take something on the order of $350 billion worth of investment, in some cases, aid, grants. We're not even talking about humanitarian assistance here, reconstruction, okay? And there's a practical problem here, and I think the Russians get this, okay? Because the Russians know the Assad regime probably better than any of us.
But do they understand the rule of law?
I don't think that's a high priority. I think what the Russians do understand is it's going to be very difficult for international financial institutions, for the United States, for Japan, for Western Europe, to make the kinds of investment, make the kinds of grants and loans if you've got Bashar al-Assad and his entourage sitting there with their hands cupped, ready to take a piece of this. Now, as an American, like everybody else here, I guess I'm basically an optimist. Yes, 5 years from now, I do see Syria in a much better place. But that's going to require very, very, very strong efforts for all of us. There is a formula out there for moving toward a national unity governing scheme. It was agreed in June 2012 by Russia, China, the United States, Great Britain, and France. Our diplomatic challenge right now, I think, is to try to convince the Russians to get that back on track.
But meanwhile, we have thousands of people that are continue to be slaughtered in the region and with very little control. You yourself stated that there's very little protection in some of these camps for folks. What more can be done to get our regional partners involved, if not Russia?
I think for all of our regional partners, there's an obligation that needs to be met in terms of providing sufficient funds for the humanitarian assistance that needs to take place. Thanks to you, ladies and gentlemen, and your colleagues in the appropriations process, the American taxpayer has been very generous in this respect.
Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hassan, I want to clear up the record based on some questions asked by my colleague from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry. He queried you whether or not there might have been access to equipment in Aleppo that might allow individuals to forge Syrian passports or official documents. And your response, as I recall, was that ISIS was not in Aleppo, that was the Free Syrian Army. Is not also true, however, that a significant faction in Aleppo was Jabhat al-Nusra or Jabhat Fatah al-Sham?
Inside Aleppo, Jabhat al-Nusra al-Qaeda was never dominant. That was true until it was expelled, until the Russians and the regime expelled the rebels from Aleppo.
Okay, but there were factions of Jabhat al-Nusra and Jabhat al-Fatah al-Sham in Aleppo, correct?
Absolutely.
And Aleppo was, prior to this upheaval, the largest city in the nation and a seat for a significant amount of government activity, correct?
Yes.
And
so remember, this was 2012, and the jihadists were not yet there in that sense.
Well, Mr. Hassan, the people who I've spoken with who were there on the ground indicated that when the Arab Spring occurred, the uprising was of individuals who had dissatisfaction with the regime, but not necessarily an intent to overthrow. Ultimately, that leadership was co-opted or even killed and replaced by elements affiliated with al-Qaeda, originally known as al-Nusra, right, and then an evolution of names. I guess what I'm driving at is the answer to Mr. Perry's question was, if they controlled the proper parts of Aleppo, al-Qaeda-affiliated elements may have had access to equipment that could be used to forge government documents. And they were in Aleppo, were they not?
In all honesty, I can't tell because I have no evidence to that or the contrary. But it's all possible. The regime. The regime still had presence inside Aleppo, so the equipment would have been taken very quickly to the west side of Aleppo, where the regime was there. But there were rumors that some biometric machines were still there.
And we know that there were elements of what was originally al-Nusra, which is morphed into an al-Qaeda affiliate, that were in control of portions of Aleppo over periods of time.
Yes, later.
Okay. I wish that Miss Dalton didn't have to leave. We've talked a lot, and her comment was, our objectives are not aligned with those of Russia. What would either you gentlemen or both articulate as our objectives?
I would say, Congressman, our principal objective is to defeat terror in Syria and keep it dead. This is a national security objective, okay? Part of that involves going after ISIL directly, militarily, as quickly as possible. This organization has been sitting in its Syrian capital of Raqqa for a few years now. It's planned and executed some major atrocities in Europe. I mean, I've been asking myself, for quite some time now, how lucky do we think we are, okay? But killing that organization is one thing. Ultimately, there has to be something resembling decent, responsive, legitimate governance in Syria to keep it dead, and this is going to be the work of several years.
So I don't want to be disrespectful, and I appreciate your time, but I have limited time. So our objective is decent, responsible government in Syria that will protect Syrians. Okay, and right now you can see that the vast bulk of, quote, anti-Assad military power on the ground is Kurdish in nature if you extract ISIS and al-Qaeda affiliated elements. Combat power on the ground, we both served, that aside from ISIS and al-Qaeda affiliated elements, the most powerful player that's, quote, anti-Assad is the Kurds.
I would say, Congressman, the Kurdish military power on the ground in Syria, the YPG, this is predominantly our ground combat component against ISIL. They're not fighting the regime.
I agree, and that's why I used quotes when I said anti-Assad, because they're included on this format as anti-Assad. They're really pro-protecting themselves. And we've had wonderful success working with Kurdish minorities, but one thing we've learned is that Kurdish minorities protect Kurdish regions and then say, why are we going this direction, right? And so the question becomes, and I know I'm almost out of time, who's the viable entity to replace the Assad regime? Because it's not ISIS or al-Qaeda. So who's there that can do it?
Congressman, there is a process, again, that was agreed to by the permanent 5 members of the Security Council on June 30th, 2012. I was there as part of the American delegation when this agreement was reached. If we can somehow get back to that process, in forming a national unity entity that will include, inevitably, members of the Syrian government, you know, who are not covered in blood over the past few years. If we can get that way, that is the beginning of the end for terrorism in Syria.
Mr. Chairman, I respect that my time's up.
All right, gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Frankel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll be quick. I have to go to another meeting, but I just, thank you both for your testimony. And I just wanted to make two points. I think it was Miss Dalton, but maybe somebody else, that talking about the necessity perhaps of making some type of deal or cooperative arrangement or using sanctions against Russia in order to influence Assad. And I think this paper we were given just shows there's such a complicated web of players, and unraveling it is a phenomenal exercise. But I want to say that if we are going to have any hope of working with Russia, then I want to respectfully suggest that this Congress needs to know the relationship of Russia to the folks currently in the White House. And the resignation today of General Flynn, I think calls in serious question as to what exactly, who knew what did they know, when did they know it, and what is the real relationship between the White House and Russia. That's number one. Number two, I think it was the ambassador that said, called what was going on in Syria a humanitarian abomination. And was that you, sir? Yes. I agree with you. I think everybody here agrees with you. I think our chairman laid out initially in his remarks the horrors of what's going on. And I could just say this. I heard the sadness in your heart of what's going on. What is it, 500,000 people probably killed, 50,000 children, the president bombing his own people. And so I want to just say what I think is another abomination, and that is the position of the United States of America that we do not want to take any of these Syrian refugees into this country. I think that's an abomination, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me get to the nitty-gritty. First of all, this is a hearing that's represented by think tanks. One of the think tanks she had to leave. But let me ask this. Do either of your think tanks receive contributions from Gulf state countries?
Sir, in the case of the Hariri Center for the Middle East, we received no government funding at all.
From private sector people from the Middle East?
Our principal donor is of Lebanese citizenship residing in Europe.
A Lebanese citizen?
Yes.
And what about from your think tank?
No Gulf money, no.
No Gulf money, and no Arab money comes
Not
in
that I'm
here.
aware of, no.
Okay. And where does your money come from?
Oh, Arab, sorry, in Egypt, yes.
But Arab money, yes.
An Egyptian businessman, the principal.
And what Arab money goes into your
Just Egypt.
Who?
Egypt.
Oh, Egypt. God, I didn't know Egypt had enough money to send over here. We just got back from there.
Not the government.
Not the government, all right. Well, thank you. Let me just note that I've just got some specific questions for you. If Assad, if we're going to compare Assad, this brutal, horrible man, to the other countries in the Gulf, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, even UAE, or now we're finding maybe Erdogan and Turkey. We know the Iranians are very brutal, but if, let's say with Qatar, let's use that as an example, if there was an uprising against the royal family in Qatar and it was financed by people from the outside trying to overthrow, basically, and insurgently to overthrow the royal family and replace it with, of course, let's say you have all of those 9 out of 10 people in Qatar are guest workers. Let's say they're declaring themselves for ISIL, and they get some support from the outside like that, basically. Do you think that the government of Qatar or these other governments would be less bloody than Assad when Assad was faced with an insurgency movement in his country? Either one of you. These are more benevolent than Assad?
I would say, Congressman, that I would find it very, very hard to imagine anyone else in the region adopting a political survival strategy that focuses almost exclusively on civilians. On civilians and on civilian terror. Okay? I think, whether we look at the Independent International Commission of Inquiry and its work, if we look at the work of major American NGOs,
I can't let you eat up
I think
my
the
time.
record is clear.
I've got 5 minutes.
Sorry.
What about you? Do you think these other countries are more benevolent than Assad?
To be honest, I don't think they would do the same.
They wouldn't do the same.
What happened in Syria?
I'm sorry, but I got a limited number of time. You both think that these powerful forces that are well armed to the teeth would permit an insurrection to succeed in their countries and not utilize their weapons to destroy and obliterate anyone who is supporting the insurgency. I think you're wrong. We'll leave that to whoever's listening to this and reading the transcript. We have 500,000 people who've been dead. Many of them are refugees. There's no doubt about that. There are, of course, a lot of people who are dead who became refugees and survived, who were leaving and fleeing ISIL, wasn't it? I mean, didn't we have the ISIL people at the same time murdering Christians by lining them up and in the grossest fashion, cutting off their heads, and engaged in yes, bombing people from the air is brutal and kills children, etc. Cutting people's heads off is a way to frighten large numbers of people and turn them into refugees. We know that happened. I will have to tell you, I do not believe that this regime in Assad's regime is any different than the rest of the regimes that I have seen for the last 28 years. And there is no reason why, you stated when we asked what our objective is to eliminate this terrorist. No, terrorism and the terrorist forces there. What we have done is our major focus is getting rid of Assad, when in fact it should be eliminating the ability of the terrorist forces in that region to commit acts that threaten our security. And we have not done that. Instead, well, by focusing instead on one dictatorial regime as compared to all the rest of those authoritarian and brutal regimes that exist in that area of the world, one regime has to go, and our focus is on getting rid of that regime. That makes no sense to me. It is not in our interests any more than it would be in our interest if another regime was under attack by an insurgency from its own people. And in this case, let us not forget, this insurgency has gone on and on and on. The amount of death that's happened has happened because we and others have given the Assad, insurgents against Assad, the idea that we are going to give them the means to succeed. And I will have to say that you're repeating, we have to go back to an agreement made by outsiders, outside powers, way back in 2012. I'm sure that gives all of those people who are fighting Assad a reason to keep on going rather than ending this struggle. And if it ends with Assad still in power, I don't think it's going to be any different than having the royal family in Qatar or UAE or Iran or Saudi Arabia or now even Erdogan in Turkey remain in power. So with that said, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and the subcommittee is adjourned. Thank the witnesses for being here.